What's up, my wizards? It's Dev from SBMTG down there on the YouTube.com. We like a game of Magic from time to time. Last time we talked about the top 20 cards in Eldritch Moon, at least from my perspective. And I asked you a question in that video: what do you want to see next? And I gave you some options there. I think there are a little over 300 comments on that video, as to date at least, and I think like 75 of them are calls for blue-red horrors, aka blue-red spells. Basically what we're going to do in this deck is play both Thing in the Ice and the new Bedlam Reveler, which is freaking awesome, by the way, and a bunch of spells to basically maximize the effectiveness of these two cards. And they do synergize with each other in some cool ways, you know. Obviously they're both horrors, so whenever you flip your Thing in the Ice, then, you know, Bedlam Reveler won't pop back to your hand. Although it'd sometimes be kind of nice if he did, but you won't have to worry about him bouncing back to your hand. And Reveler has good synergy with Thing, because when you play your Reveler and you haven't transformed your Thing in the Ice yet, you'll draw 3 cards, and that'll help fuel your Thing in the Ice. Also, since we're building around these two cards, it lets us name the deck something better, you know? Like, Blue-Red Horrors is a thing, but we're only playing the 2 horrors. Blue-Red Spells is a thing, but it's not too jazzy. Playing these 2 cards, we could call the deck Thing in the Bed, and that's just hilarious. But how to actually build this deck, you know? The deck has gone through a few different iterations, and I actually took an extra, like, day and a half making this deck, because the deck completely changed like halfway through me building it. So this time, it's not quite a double deck tech, but I'm going to show you first here what this deck originally looked like. I played full 4 of playsets of both Thing and Bedlam Reveler, and then the rest of the deck is completely just spells, and also a couple of copies of Jory in there. This played like Slip Through Space and Expedite, and I just wanted to play as many 1 mana cost spells as I possibly could to try and get these things to both transform Thing in the Ice and just get played Bedlam Reveler as quickly as possible. But that just didn't feel quite right. You know, I ran with this for a couple of days and decided to try it out, and it's not a terrible deck, it just doesn't feel quite right. It doesn't synergize the way you want it to all the time, and I felt like what you really wanted to do with this deck was try and make it more of a mid-range or control deck. The deck is fine with going a little bit later into the game, because you're not going to flip Thing in the Ice until turn 4, turn 5, ideally. Same thing with Reveler. You're not going to play Bedlam Reveler until turn 4 or 5. So going as fast as possible isn't necessarily the right idea. The deck lives in the middle turns, so we're going to build a mid-range deck here, and we're going to base it a lot around Todd Anderson's blue-red control deck that a lot of people riffed on for the last 6 months here. You know, there's been subtle changes to the deck, but the shell has remained the same, and we're going to play around with that and end up with a really competitive deck. One more thing on the deck that I tried out first. I feel like Fast could possibly work in Modern, where we have access to spells like Thought Scour, even Gitaxian Probe, that's a free spell in the graveyard, and we have things like Lightning Bolt in Modern, which I think access to Lightning Bolt would really help this deck a lot. With those things considered, here's what we ended up with. I'm going to start with the creatures, which we're playing a whole 10 of. You don't want to play a whole lot of creatures in this deck, because you want, again, at least 20 plus spots for spells in the deck. So you really don't have a whole lot of room for creatures. Now, what we're going to do is play 3 copies of Thing in the Ice and 4 copies of Bedlam Reveler. Didn't take me long to realize that you don't need a whole 4 copies of Thing in the Ice. You just don't. But Bedlam Reveler, I want to play all the copies of that I possibly can. People are calling this Ancestral Recall on a stick, and that's 9 times out of 10. That is right. You're either going to play this with just like, you know, you're going to play it for 2 or 3 most of the time, and it's going to come down on turn 4 or 5, which is great too, because it's a turn 4 or 5 play that doesn't require all of your mana. So when you draw those 3 cards, even if you discarded your hand, you know, 2, 3 cards, even if you draw, when you do draw those 3 cards, you'll be able to have the mana to play some of the spells that you drew. That's very important. That leaves us 3 open slots for creatures, and I'm going to use all of them on Jace Vryn's Prodigy here. There are other things you could use. I am very interested in using Curious Homunculus in this deck and Voracious Reader by proxy there. That seems like a very good choice, but all in all, I think that Jace wins that battle. And these decks have, at least historically, the last few months, played a couple of copies of Jory and Ruin Diver, but now that we've got Bedlam Reveler, I just don't see that much of a reason to play Jory in anymore. It looked like one of the more cuttable pieces to begin with in the deck, and now, since we've got something as powerful as Reveler, I think we can finally cut the card. But that leaves us with 3 copies of Jace Vryn's Prodigy, which is really, really nice, by the way. The card has always been good, obviously. Fetches a pretty good price, but notice, $35 price tag on TCG Player right now. It's going down, ladies and gentlemen. But we can only play it in Standard, at least, for the next couple of months. But this has good synergy, you know, obviously, with Thing in the Ice. It allows us to recast spells, and that'll take counters off of Thing in the Ice. Extra mileage, always good. And it's got cool synergy with Bedlam Reveler. Early in the game, it'll fill the graveyard for Bedlam Reveler. You can cast him for cheaper. And then later on in the game, you can recast spells that Bedlam Reveler is dumped into your graveyard. You play Bedlam Reveler, you discard your hand, you draw the 3 cards, or you can dump spells in your graveyard for Jace to then recast. So that's all of our creatures. I'll move on to just the one copy of a Planeswalker that we're playing. Usually these control decks, these blue-red control decks, will play 2 Chandra. I'm just playing the 1, and I do think it is still very, very important to play Chandra, and I'm playing another copy of her in the board here. Just Chandra, very powerful red card, right? Probably the most powerful red card in the format. She's a win condition, she's a sweeper, she draws you a bunch of cards. Just play Chandra. Before we get into the spells, there is one more kind of card I want to mention before we get there, and that is artifacts. You probably guess what it is. There's 2 copies of Pyromancer's Goggles in the deck, and some would play 3, but I think with the addition of Reveler, we're drawing even more cards, and we can more easily draw into this. And with Reveler in the deck, by the way, Reveler's another win condition in and of himself. So it's not as important to play Goggles, which is basically another win condition, you know? And this does synergize with a lot of things that we're doing in the spell base. So I think it's still important to play Goggles just because it allows for just insane plays. Now there's 22 spots left in the deck for spells if we want to play 25 lands, which I think we should with the Chandras and the Goggles and the whatnots. So we got 22 slots open for spells, which is I think where we want to be, anywhere between 20 and 24, 25. So we're right in the middle of where we want to be here, and we'll start with 3 copies of Magmatic Insight. Obviously very good with Pyromancer's Goggles, but I just like it as a, almost guaranteed turn 1 play. We don't have too many of those. We've got other turn 1 plays, but they're all removal and dependent on what our opponent does early in the game. This, we can just play, if we have a land in our hand. So that's good. It puts a card in the graveyard for Bedlam Reveler early. That's important too. Works well with Goggles. Just play Magmatic Insight. The card is fantastic, obviously. But as far as those removal 1-drops, we'll start with 2 copies of Fiery Impulse. I think it's more important to play this card than ever right now because Bad Company, tokens, and especially even white aggro, this card works very well against, are all the best decks in the format, probably. So Fiery Impulse is incredibly important to play, and I could see actually playing a whole playset, but we're going to move the other 2 copies to the board here and just play 2 in the main. But those are very, very important decks that a lot of people are playing, and Fiery Impulse is very good against them, so definitely pack a couple of copies of those main. Let's talk about our sort of madness suite here for a second. We're playing 3 cards that I want to talk about all at the same time because you often see them all at the same time. We're playing 2 copies of Lightning Axe, 4 copies of Tormenting Voice, and 4 copies of Fiery Temper. Now, I like these cards like Lightning Axe and Tormenting Voice in this deck that make you discard cards because they are also very good with Bedlam Reveler. You're just dropping more cards in the graveyard or instants and sorceries in a perfect world into the graveyard to help fuel Bedlam Reveler and cast him for cheaper. So these things that make you discard cards are much better. Even than usual. In Fiery Temper, we just have to have. It's just a perfect madness piece, and we can copy it with Goggles. It's direct damage. All of that is very good. Hits Planeswalkers and players too if we need it to. So Fiery Temper, just a perfect card for the deck. I'm going to play 3 copies of Incindiary Flow in the deck. Card's been pretty good, and the best thing about it is that it can be copied with Pyromancer's Goggles, honestly. 6 damage with this is great, and you can actually deal 9 in the same turn with it if you copy it with the Pyromancer's Goggles and then cast it out of your graveyard with the Jace. That is 9 damage in the same turn for like 4 mana, and one of it came from Pyromancer's Goggles, so it's like 3 lands and a Goggles. You got yourself 9 damage. That can just win you the game outright. So Incendiary Flow is great against creatures, great against walkers, great against players, and you can do a bunch of damage if you play your cards right. I'm also going to play a single copy of Nagging Thoughts in the deck. I just wanted a 5th card that had madness. We're discarding a bunch of cards in this deck, and I just wanted another option as far as madness went. It also allows us to dump more cards in our graveyard to cast Bedlam Reveler for cheaper. It also helps out Jace sometimes by dumping more stuff in the graveyard. So it's our only non-red instant or sorcery in the whole deck, but I just wanted this one slot to be devoted to at least another madness piece, and it synergizes with other stuff too, so Nagging Thoughts ain't half bad. Here's a weird one, 2 copies of Nahiri's Wrath. Now, I and some other people have had bad things to say about the card during spoiler season, but this is exactly the deck I like it in. This card synergizes very well with Bedlam Reveler. I've talked about how these discard outlets synergize with him, but this is the ultimate way of synergizing with him, On turn 3, you can play this, discard like 3 other spells, basically instants or sorceries, basically wrath their side of the board, and then next turn you'll almost certainly be able to play Bedlam Reveler and then refill your hand and have a good body on the board when you just wiped their side of the board. Like, that play is very, very real. I actually really like the card a lot, and it's good against all these small decks in the format, because turn 3 we can take out like 3 different guys and set up really nice plays. So, big fan of the performance in the deck so far, at least, but I don't want to play too many copies of it. And to finish off the spells, just 1 copy of Fall of the Titans, which has been a win condition for the deck throughout its lifespan, and I want to keep that tradition alive here. Sometimes this can just come out of nowhere and deal like 10 damage to them and kill a couple of their guys, you know, like, or kill a couple of other guys. Just very, very good. When you copy it with Goggles, yes, the value of X gets copied if you play it with if you copy it with Goggles. So you can just take out like a bunch of guys if you want to do that. You know, you can hit them in the face for a lot of damage. Just very good win condition, and also it can be a sweeper sometimes. Follow the Titan stays in if it only a singleton copy. There's 25 lands in the deck, which is a lot more than I was playing at first. The first deck that I showed you had like 22 lands because it was mostly cheap spells. But in this deck, again, we're trying to get to gauntlets, or goggles, excuse me. We're trying to get to goggles, and we're trying to get to Chandra. And there's a lot of turns where all the way up until the 5th or 6th turn, we'll use all of our mana in one turn. You know, we play Bedlam Reveler, we draw 3, and we're probably going to use more of our mana that turn. So, pretty mana-intensive deck here. We want to play as many lands as possible. Here's our sideboard right here, and it's fairly typical, but we can tell we're doing some tricksy stuff with our sideboard. 4 copies of Sphinx's Tutelage. This could really just be a Sphinx's Tutelage deck, to be honest with you. Bedlam Reveler's very good with Tutelage. You know, we're drawing a bunch of cards off of all of our different spells. We got Jace in the deck, Chandra's in here, so like, it could be really, really good, by the way, with Sphinx's Tutelage. But, you know, I feel like that's a good sideboard call against certain decks, mostly control-oriented decks and black-white control, slower things. Very good against those decks. And also, Fevered Visions can be very good against control decks, too. It all depends on your local meta, but I like to have both of these options, honestly, and Visions is really, really good for us and bad for most decks. Here are your power rankings right here. A final score of Nintendo 64, which is pretty competitive. I mean, it's kind of a misleading score. It should be a little bit higher than that, but the stuff that we don't do well, we don't do well. I mean, our offense could be a little bit better, although we do turn the corner well. This is more or less a control deck in a lot of ways. And our speed isn't very good either, but we don't really care that much. So, but there were a lot of really versatile plays in the deck, and we're pretty defensive. We got something like 14 removal spells in the deck. That's a lot. And we're drawing a bunch of cards going through the deck quickly, which helps versatility, resiliency, and even consistency, obviously. So those numbers are improved a lot by the card drawing aspect of the deck. The price tag on the main deck is something like $175, and the sideboard will cost you about $25, give or take. So you're looking at about $200 for the deck at large here, but it's a really, really fun deck. This is just for those that like chaining together spells and getting huge plays a little bit in towards the mid game, you know. So there would be times where you play your Bedlam Reveler and you flip your thing in the ice after playing a couple spells that you got from the Reveler. It's just like, things really come together a lot of the time starting around turn 4 or 5. And you just have all these neat plays that are available to you, especially once you get a Goggles out. Things start going crazy. You can deal a bunch of damage all at one time, you know. And Bedlam Reveler is just crazy. It's a really, really good card, I'm telling you guys. So try this thing out, but before we just finish out the deck tag like we normally would, I do want to touch on a couple of cards the deck could play. First thing I want to point out is that the deck could probably benefit from at least a one-of copy of Epiphany at the Drownyard, as that would put stuff into your graveyard and help out Bedlam Reveler and help out Jace sometimes when you need it to. That's not going to come up often, but mostly Bedlam Reveler. So I think one copy of Epiphany might not be a bad idea. I'm just not totally sure about it either, and I like red spells, specifically in this deck. For the same reason I like red spells. I didn't play Unsubstantiate. A lot of people don't like Unsubstantiate, but a lot of pro players, at least in Standard, do. And a lot of people, you know, Seth Mansfield made a blue-red deck, and he posted it not long ago. I think it was on Star City. And he plays to Unsubstantiate in that deck, and he's a former world champion, and he won like Grand Prix New York. So like, he's a really good player, and he likes Unsubstantiate. I just don't know that it goes in this deck, but it could. Very, very versatile card, and could help us out on turn 2 if we needed it to do that. So not a bad choice, but again, I like red spells in this deck. As far as creatures go, I've already said I don't want to play a bunch of creatures, but some people might want to play Storm Chaser Mage in this, but the better creature I think is Goblin Dark Dwellers. The deck could possibly benefit from a 1 or 2 of copy of Dark Dwellers, but I'm not sure, especially considering it's competing with Goggles at that slot, and we don't want to play all the 5 drops. But it could be a thing. Aside from that, the only other thing I want to talk about is Scour the Laboratory. We're playing 6 different kinds of cards in this deck. We've got Wandering Fumaroles that can go to the graveyard, and we're just discarding a bunch of cards. You know, Magmatic Insight is in the deck, so lands getting into the graveyard won't be hard. We got Planeswalkers, we got artifacts and stuff. So getting Delirium might not be too hard, but I don't know that this card goes in the deck. Although if this is a dedicated Sphinx's Tutelage deck, with Tutelage in the main deck, I think Laboratory goes in. That's all we've got for now, so let me know what you want to see next time. This time, just the other 2 options that I gave you in the last video. It's either going to be Budget Odric, a black-white Odric deck that's looking pretty skillful, actually, or the green-black Delirium deck, which I've been working super hard on, actually. If you can't tell, I've been working dumb hard on all these decks lately. You know, this deck completely morphed in utero, basically, and I've been working super hard on Delirium, and I'm just like completely fully neck-bearded out here. And as always, let me know what else you want to see. There's lots of stuff. Mono white mid-range, I'm still working on Harmless Pact, that deck as well. Lots of stuff coming down the pipeline, zombies, all that. So stay tuned, and if you enjoy the content, like the content. Also share, comment, do all the things. I want to know how you feel about it, and then subscribe if you're new so you can get all the rest of the deck techs for the season. So I'll be working hard. Thanks you for watching, my wizards.